Hello viewers, I am the Comics Kid 2099 and I am doing something a little different today. In the past, I've had many different kinds of videos that I like to do. Sometimes I do something called Missed Opportunities, where I am sitting in front of the camera and I talk about a comic book or a TV show or a movie or whatever that I think did something wrong, and I speak about what I think the story should have done. And then in the past, very recently in fact, I've taken a great deal of time to essentially rewrite movie franchises that I think were fundamentally scarred in some way and need a lot of time and energy to be fixed. I did this with the Star Wars prequels as well as the X-Men films. I find myself in a position where I want to do this with the recent Star Trek movie from 2009, simply called Star Trek, and the sequel from earlier this year, titled Star Trek Into Darkness. But the X-Men movie franchise numbers 6 movies to the franchise, with at least 2 more to come. And while there were only 3 Star Wars prequels, I did spend some of the time in that video talking about the original trilogy, as well as a very little bit of the expanded universe material that I'm familiar with. But with the Star Trek films, I won't be spending 2 hours talking about what I think should have been done. So in short, this will be a halfway point between my Missed Opportunities videos and my really lengthy rewrite videos. I won't be sitting in front of the camera like I am in my Missed Opportunities videos because I feel like I produce better videos when I'm reading a script into a microphone. Secrets of the Comics Kid 2099 revealed. And this will not be 2 hours long, because while I have some significant problems with the last 2 Star Trek movies, they are still only 2 movies, and so I won't be speaking for very long like I have in the past. And also, I did a half-hour on-the-road review of Into Darkness, where I spewed out many of my first impression reactions to that movie immediately after seeing it. So if you've been keeping up with my channel for a while, you have very likely heard some of this ranting before. So even though I once burdened everyone who watched the video with my thoughts on why I hated the Into Darkness movie, the big reason I'm returning to that subject for today's video is because fairly recently the internet had a mild rage moment over this film. I say mild because this event did not involve Ben Affleck or Miley Cyrus. Apparently, some fans of Star Trek recently voted Star Trek Into Darkness as the worst Star Trek film ever. Now, even though I really hated this movie, and I will explain why later in this video, I don't think this is a very accurate summation of the movie. We've had plenty of Star Trek movies that were bad. I think everyone agrees that Star Trek The Final Frontier and Nemesis are both really awful. I know some people, though not as many as the ones who publicly decry Final Frontier and Nemesis, will say that all of the TNG movies are bad. I tend to fall somewhere close to that camp, as I do think that all of the TNG movies are bad in some way, though I wouldn't be able to sit down and tell you specifically why in great detail, as it's been years since I saw any of them. I know I'm one of the only ones who thinks this, but I actually think that Star Trek The Voyage Home is really awful, even though it is hailed as a fantastic Star Trek movie. So in short, I think that saying Into Darkness is the worst Star Trek movie ever is a little extreme. We've had movies that on paper just weren't very good ideas in the first place, and we've had movies that just weren't very well made, and then we've had movies that many people have argued and spilt blood over. But I did hate the movie, so surely I had reasons for my bile, right? So naturally, before I go any further with this video, I will be spoiling some elements of both Into Darkness and the 2009 Star Trek film. If you have not seen either of those movies and you want to maintain some element of surprise when going into them, then I advise you to turn this video off now. Okay, so first, I think I should explain just where I was emotionally when I first saw the 2009 Star Trek film. Keep in mind that before this film, the last movie that we had was Star Trek Nemesis, and well, the less said about that movie the better. Not to mention, I never was an original series guy. I always preferred The Next Generation because that was what I grew up with. A quick disclaimer. Since then, I have come to appreciate both crews and eras of this show. I like some original series, I like some TNG, I like much Deep Space Nine. So knowing that we were going to get another Star Trek movie made me think that we would be getting another movie on par with Nemesis. And knowing that it was the original crew, well, new actors playing the original crew, didn't exactly light any fires of enthusiasm under my chair. My expectations were essentially in the basement. Now that movie, it ain't perfect. I'm not the first person to say that, I won't be the last. It had some problems. The story itself is not very original, and in some places it flat out does not make any sense. I've watched the movie 3 or 4 times, and I still cannot tell you exactly how Kirk went from being a student at the Academy to being a captain on the Enterprise in 2 hours. And even though I know there was a deleted scene showing that Nero and his crew were kept in the Klingon prison world for 25 years, that scene was foolishly deleted, so in the movie that we get, we're just supposed to accept that after coming back in time when Kirk was born, that he then waited a quarter of a century to act out against the Federation, not bothering to warn his people that their planet was going to be destroyed in a couple hundred years. So yeah, the movie has some big problems, but seeing as how I did not go into this movie expecting a masterpiece, I actually enjoyed it. And even though at the time that I had seen the movie, my only real exposure to the original crew was from the movies they were in, I thought that this new generation of actors did a good job portraying those older characters. Some of them, like Zoe Saldana, she isn't really playing the same character as her predecessor, but that's not her fault, that's the script's fault. But where I came down on this movie, at the end of the day, was that it was better than what I expected. Which, if you'll recall, I expected it to be the turd of all turds. And also, I feel like this movie had certain goals that it had to meet, and at least in my opinion, it met those goals, even if, objectively speaking, it's not the best movie in the world. In many ways, this movie is like a pilot episode for an ongoing series, or, in this case, a new franchise of movies. It's really just a setup for better stories that will come later down the line. I've seen many pilot episodes that are not themselves very good, but very often they're not so much meant to be good, but rather they're meant to get across information and set everything up so that people will come back for the actual stories. This movie had to be accessible to people who had never seen a Star Trek movie, and I know people who are not big Star Trek fans who did like this movie, and it also ideally would be capturing the hearts and minds of people who were big Star Trek fans. Here, I'm not entirely sure if it did its job. See, I would put myself somewhere in the middle of these two categories. I am not a complete rookie when it comes to Star Trek, nor am I a hardcore fan. But let's get back to this movie acting as a pilot episode and the goals I believe it was setting out to achieve. In trying to make this movie appeal to non-Star Trek fans and people who love Star Trek, they did what I think was really their only course of action. Do what is kinda sorta an origin piece for the original Star Trek. But, and this is maybe the one big thing I appreciate about this new version of Star Trek, they had a way that they were not going to have to alienate the people they were hoping to bring into this movie. They opened this movie by both connecting this film to the previous 40 years of Star Trek stories with the use of time travelers from the last point we saw in the original Star Trek universe. Using the time travelers traveling to the past, they allowed these guys to mess around with the past, creating an alternate reality. This really is a pretty good way to cater to both camps of people. The new fans don't have to be familiar with the past 40 years of stories because, in theory, this movie is now part of a brand new universe that will not be traversing the same path as the original timeline. I will get to that later. And the hardcore fans, they were placated by the appearance of old time-traveling Spock from the original timeline. This wasn't just a reboot that was spitting in the face of everything that fans loved. It was saying that the fans and their version of Star Trek really was important. At least that's how I saw it. I know many people have said that this Star Trek movie is disrespectful of the original Star Trek. And maybe this is because I'm not a hardcore fan, but I just don't see it that way. Sure, this movie invents a whole bunch of brand new aliens we've never seen in Star Trek before. And yeah, there are half a dozen things in this movie that don't quite jive with the original timeline, regardless of time travel altering this reality. You can see Red Letter Media cover some of these in great detail if you wish. Let's not make the mistake of saying that unfamiliarity with the franchise is disrespecting the franchise. J.J. Abrams may not know that the Green Girl is an Orion slave girl, but he wouldn't be here wasting time doing this movie if he didn't have a desire in igniting interest in this franchise once again. And don't tell me this is just a paycheck for him either. I think that someone with as much Hollywood clout as J.J. Abrams can get a paycheck doing just about anything. I really do think that even if he is not fluent in every single thing about Star Trek, Abrams really does have a fondness for this franchise, and I think he wanted to make people care about it again. Which, well, you could argue that the last time people really cared was when Deep Space Nine ended. Yeah, I know, there are fans of Voyager and there are fans of Enterprise, but I'm definitely not one myself, and I feel like it's good to not admit to being a fan of either of those things myself, but that could just be the non-Trekkie in me speaking out of turn. So let me recap really quickly. The 2009 movie. It is not perfect, but I feel like it at least did its job. The job being to bring people to the theater and get them interested in Star Trek once again. And it got new people interested as well. It had some issues that are pretty glaring, and at least for me, every time I watch it, I usually come away from it forgetting most of it, except for the bare bones of it all. But it was and remains a fun movie, and like any pilot episode, even with all of its problems, I am very willing to forgive those problems as long as the next movie that is being set up is better. And that's where my hatred of Into Darkness comes in. I do not think that Into Darkness is better. I've seen many people say that it is, and it's entirely possible that it's because they went into the 2009 film with different expectations than I did. And by the same token, I am dead certain that these people went into Darkness with different expectations than I. Even with the reservations I had going into the movie, I was expecting it to be better than what I ultimately got. What reservations, you may be asking? Those reservations, or rather that single reservation, was Khan. Years before this movie came out, shortly after seeing the 2009 film, I remember thinking, oh, it would be really cool if they got Khan for the next movie. And then I started thinking of guys who I would love to see as Khan. Oded Fehr, Nestor Carbonell, Naveen Andrews. Any of those guys, in my humble, could have brought the same level of gravitas that Ricardo Montalban brought to the role in the original series episode Space Seed and in 1982's Wrath of Khan. Now, you may know where this is going. I really love Benedict Cumberbatch. The BBC television series Sherlock is actually my favorite live-action television show that is on the air right now, even though it is on hiatus. And I have no doubt that my love for that show would be exponentially less if Cumberbatch was not in the show doing his thing. But folks, there is one thing you've probably noticed about Benedict. He's white. And I don't want to turn this into a dialogue of race relations in the modern era. I really don't. In both Space Seed and Wrath of Khan, Khan being from India was never really a large part of who he was as a character. It was incidental, really, like the color of your eyes or something. Daniel Craig has blonde hair, James Bond is allegedly supposed to have jet black hair, but that's not part of who he is as a person, that sort of thing. And I made this comparison when I first reviewed Into Darkness. This year we got a movie called The Man of Steel, rebooting Superman. Perry White was played by Lawrence Fishburne, a black man. I have no problem with this. But imagine in the Superman-Batman film that comes out in 2015, if Perry White is now played by Bill Murray, a white man. This would still be the same franchise, but his skin color would have inexplicably changed color. This is the same sort of scenario that we got with Khan in Into Darkness. I imagine the people making this movie felt a little bit uncomfortable about something. Maybe they didn't want to get accusations of being racist from people. After all, we live in a post-9/11 world, and maybe they were afraid that people would see them as being, I don't know, mean to people from the Middle East by casting a Middle Eastern actor or someone who looked like they could play a Middle Eastern character as the villain of the movie. Maybe they were uncomfortable with that prospect. Maybe they just didn't think that they could sell a movie with a non-white actor. Although I tend to think that neither of those are entirely true because at one point, Benicio del Toro was set to be the villain of this movie, and I can only assume he would have been Khan and not Admiral Marcus. Now, Benicio is Puerto Rican, so I guess he could have passed as a Sikh in the same way that Montalban did in the 1960s and the 1980s. Now, like I said, I don't have a problem with recasting a character with a different skin color if you're doing a reboot or a revamp or a relaunch. When you're disregarding what came before, it's okay. But this movie is part of a franchise that is trying to be both a reboot accessible for non-Star Trek fans and at the same time be an extension of the old franchise and be accessible to Star Trek fans. The very premise of this movie ensures that this franchise is not a reboot even if it pretends like it is acting like a reboot. Remember, in the 2009 Star Trek film, Nero travels to the day that Kirk was born, which is sometime in the future. As per the original Star Trek lore, Khan was actually from the 1990s and was put into suspended animation and then awoken in the future during the events of the original Star Trek series. Now, if you wanted to change something, like, say, Carol Marcus, if you wanted to say that thanks to the time-traveling shenanigans of Spock and Nero from the future, Carol decided to join Starfleet instead of being a non-Starfleet doctor like she was in Wrath of Khan, if you wanted to say that, I could maybe buy that, maybe. But Khan is from a time period before Nero and Spock came back and altered everything. So in theory, Khan, being awakened sometime in between the 2009 film and this film, should be exactly the same as he was in Space Seed. And like I said, Khan is now somehow a white guy. Like I said, the character of Khan could almost have been any race in the Space Seed episode. What was notable about him was his charisma, his determination, and his cunning. Being an Indian was just a side note. And that was always something very noteworthy about the original series. They didn't draw attention to the fact that Sulu was Asian or Uhura was black. She kissed Kirk and audiences made a big deal about it, but for Kirk, she was just another skirt for him to make out with. But it all comes back to what this movie is. They went out of their way in the 2009 film to try and keep the fans of Star Trek and bring new fans to this movie. At some point along the way, they must have forgotten about that mission, because although I would argue this movie barely covers any new ground and is about 90% retread of Trek stories we've seen before, it doesn't really feel like they're trying as hard to keep the die-hard fans. Oh, we've made some money with this first movie. Now it's okay to do something that they don't like. But then, if you're going to try and alienate the fans, and I won't say that casting Khan as a white guy alone alienated fans, then why bother trying to make a story that tries so hard to remind people of the old Star Trek? We have specific moments in this movie that are callbacks to old Trek. These moments are going to feel like normal non-fan service moments to someone who has never seen the old Trek. We have little things like mentioning of the mud incident, or Bones helping a Gorn give birth, or a dead Tribble, things like that. Then we have frickin' enormous things like Spock Kirk hand glass thing from Wrath of Khan, or the engine is in trouble, it's leaking radiation, someone knocks someone else out and goes to save the day regardless of the harm that it will do them. Or the Khan scream, or heck, using Khan as the villain, and basically rewriting the script for Space Seed and using it for this movie. This is where things just do not make any sense to me. I get that the 2009 film was trying to bring two distinct sets of audiences to the seats and give them a movie that would make them interested in Trek. In my opinion, it did that. Now, once you do a sequel, you need to make a good story. You've already got both camps of people. You don't have to try again to bring those people back. Although, admittedly, waiting 4 years to do a sequel is probably not smart, as some people coming to see this movie probably had forgotten that there was a previous film in this franchise. And before you tell me that that is preposterous, I went to see The Dark Knight Rises with someone who had forgotten that Batman Begins even existed, so there. After you've got those people, and you've established to at least half of them that this is an alternate universe, then you should tell a story that can exist in this alternate universe. Admittedly, some of the stories from the original timeline would still play out virtually the same as they would have, regardless of the time travel tomfoolery from before. But that can be what the comic book stories from IDW is all about. And in fact, the IDW series is doing that. They did a Tribble storyline, they did the episode Where No Man Has Gone Before, so let that be where you try to recapture the glory days of yesteryear. But when you've specifically set up that this is an alternate universe where things are likely to be different, and it's very likely the reason you set up that idea is so that you don't have to adhere to the old canon and you can do whatever you want, then why not do something with that concept? Instead, the destruction of Vulcan, which was the key factor from the previous movie that established that this was not part of the original reality, is barely a footnote here. We see old Spock for about 15 seconds in Into Darkness, and now I guess everyone on the Enterprise is aware of time-traveling Spock, which I'm pretty sure was at least somewhat kept a secret between a few people in the previous movie. The destruction of Vulcan was apparently the catalyst for Starfleet, air quotes, aggressively exploring space. Why would they aggressively explore space after a world is destroyed? What is the line of logic there? And finding the Botany Bay and releasing Khan from suspended animation, which I said in my review of the film, how contrived is that? Out of 73 pods in this dimension and in the previous reality, Khan is the one they wake up in both? Seriously? So here comes the missed opportunity part. Bear in mind, in my opinion, these movies really should have done more to take advantage of the fact that this world is now part of an alternate reality. First, I'll talk about a few things the first movie should have done differently, and then I'll move on to the next movie. My biggest issue with this movie is that it feels the need to put Kirk in the captain's chair. If you're going to start off with Kirk as a student at the academy, and Spock is the first officer to Pike, and then you take Pike out of the picture, then how cool would it have been to just keep Spock as the captain for a while? Maybe even for multiple movies. Remember, one of the biggest what the heck moments of the 2009 movie is my uncertainty of how they get Kirk to somehow outranking everyone even though he is still a student. That would be like if someone was still in college, then became the dean of the school, and was now outranking his professors who had years of experience under their belts. If that sounds stupid, that's because it is stupid. Now, I wouldn't mind if old Spock was still in this movie and told Kirk that when he came from, Kirk was always the captain of the Enterprise and outranked Spock. But it's foolishness to think that just because that's how it was, that it has to be that way in this new altered timeline. Which old Spock knows it's an altered timeline as he saw the destruction of his home world. So if he's made it his mission to make this reality more like his own, then what's he going to do about the millions of dead Vulcans? So yeah, I think it'd be neat if young Kirk knew that it was supposed to be his path to be in that chair, but now the arrogant little snot has to be content with the fact that he is not in the chair and taking orders from a guy who doesn't like him and the feeling is mutual. That kind of scenario is ripe for storytelling possibilities. Another thing I feel like this film could have done is something that could also have been done in Into Darkness. What if this movie killed off someone who the fans expect to live? I know that this movie kills Amanda Grayson, and technically she's at least supposed to live to give advice to Spock in Star Trek IV, but she's hardly a character that people care about, right? Now, don't let what I'm about to say be any indication of my lack of love for these characters, but what if this movie had killed off Scotty? Or heck, don't even use him at all, since he's barely in this movie anyway. Or what if they killed Chekhov or Sulu, someone who, in our Trek minds, we think of as major characters? I love what most of the actors are doing with these roles, but if we lost Sulu in the battle to destroy the space drill, then everyone would have lost their poop even worse than when Vulcan exploded. And it's not like the movies are doing anything important with these characters, really. Sulu is just there to fulfill fan service for anyone who likes that character as the captain of the Excelsior. Chekhov is just there to say Wessels in a funny accent and have knowledge of transporters for no discernible reason. So if we had seen one of these guys die, then this would be absolutely cemented as an alternate reality. The other thing is something I actually expected the follow-up to the 2009 film to cover, but it is related to this film. We see that the future Romulans left some technology on Earth in the form of the space drill. I was expecting this to alter time even further. It's at least 100 years more advanced than anything any of these guys have ever seen. What if the humans in Starfleet were trying to backwards engineer this thing and make better technology that wouldn't even exist until another 100 years or so? This would have been yet another way to show the ripple effect in this universe. And this would segue into my next idea for how this franchise could have and should have taken advantage of the alternate reality thing. Into Darkness kind of beats around the bush with the idea that Starfleet is very nearly at war with the Klingons. Now, I know that the Klingons were bad guys in the original series, but it always seemed like every time they encountered the Enterprise, it was more of an impolite skirmish and not a full-on war. Maybe this movie could have just done the Klingon-Starfleet war instead of saying, oh look, we're almost wanting to do it, but not quite. Or maybe do something with the Romulans of this era. Maybe they lay claim to the space drill as it belongs to the Romulans from the future, and if they don't get it back, they will declare war. Or if you don't want to do anything with the space drill, then just say that thanks to the terrorist actions of Nero in the first film, humans now have a greater animosity toward anything non-human, like Klingons or Romulans, or even allies to Starfleet like the Vulcans. And then maybe you could say that Starfleet initiates hostilities with the Romulans or the Klingons or both. They know that the Romulans from the future are still pretty anti-Federation, so they're not going to sit around and wait for the Romulans to do stuff to them. They're going to declare war against them. They might even try to use the space drill, because seriously, it's like Chekhov's phaser. They introduce it by leaving it on Earth, but they don't fire it against Romulus, and then you've got a moral conundrum, which is something Trek has tried to do in past films and has had mixed results. And you might say that they set up the idea of Starfleet going to war in this movie and that they will pay it off in the next movie. But I'm not entirely sure that they will, since the first movie seemingly set up the idea of this being an alternate universe where anything can happen, and then the very next movie is one where the same thing we've seen before is what happens. And also, this movie really does feel more like a prequel to the original series and less like an alternate universe. They end with the crew about to embark on a 5-year mission, and to see that story, go to Netflix and watch a TV show that aired almost 50 years ago. So no, I'm not confident that we're going to get a war with the Klingons or anything like that in Star Trek 3, but I think we should have gotten something like that here. Maybe even keep the story of a corrupt Starfleet admiral, there seems to be many of them throughout history, trying to accelerate hostilities between the nations. And sure, this would have seemed like a really dark place to take the franchise, and many people see Trek as being something considerably more upbeat and hopeful. But I think you could go in this direction and then earn your hopeful upbeat message or tone. And also, it should be obvious by now that I'm much more okay with this not being the original Star Trek. I do think, with the way this new franchise has opened, the idea of trying to go home again is just preposterous. I really think that this series of movies should be doing one thing with characters that are familiar but different, and then if we want to see the old kind of Trek, then either A, do stories set in the Prime timeline, or B, watch the old stories from that timeline, as both are relatively easy to do, I would think. The next thing that this movie should have avoided is using Khan. This all goes back to the very premise of this series of movies. If you want this to be an alternate universe where things are different than how we know them, then why not do something different? I know I'm spinning my wheels here, but really, was there any need to just repeat the old story of Khan? And yeah, there's some stuff in this movie that is not Space Seed or Wrath of Khan, like Admiral Marcus trying to start a war with the Klingons. But I really think that that could have been its own movie. In fact, Khan and the other 72 survivors from the eugenics wars almost seem shoehorned in this movie when you think about it. But if you absolutely feel the only way to get the Trek fans here is to rehash an old story that they know, then there's numerous ways that they could have done it. 1. They could have had Cumberbatch play someone from the eugenics wars who is not Khan, Noonien, and Scene. This was a theory I read about maybe a month or two before the movie came out. The theory I read, I think, was that this guy was actually a descendant from some kid that Khan didn't know he had, and that the main mission was to find Khan's pod and wake him up. And then you'd have Khan as the villain in the third movie. I like that idea okay, and in the era where after credits scenes are commonplace, that wouldn't have been too hard to do, especially if we knew for certain that this was going to be a trilogy, which I don't think we did. But the other idea, which is less complicated I think, is that Benedict is still your villain, and he is just Joe Schmo, not Khan. And then you could still have him release Khan at the end, and that's your big hook for the third movie. If you don't like those ideas, then just don't use Benedict and cast someone who looks like he could play Khan. One of those guys I mentioned earlier would be nice. And since this is an alternate reality, even though the Khan would still be the same since he's from a time period that is not affected by the changes Spock or Nero made to the timeline, then maybe Khan wouldn't even be a villain in this reality. Maybe, thanks to the destruction of Vulcan and the more aggressive militant atmosphere of this reality, Khan would fit right in and he'd be an ally to the crew and to Starfleet. Albeit he'd probably still have conquest on his mind, since that was his motivation from the 1990s before he was put in suspended animation. But he might wait it out and bide his time, and not try anything for another movie. You could sort of play Khan as Harry Osborn in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. We know he's going to be evil, but right now he's not. I will say this would have tickled me to no end, because some of my favorite parts of the Into Darkness that we got were the parts where Khan was working with the crew, simply because this is stuff we have not seen before, and that's really what it boils down to. This movie disappointed me the most when it wasn't being bold enough. I feel like all of these decisions would have been bolder than just about anything that we got, and maybe it's just me tooting my own horn, I don't know. I'm sure people will disagree with what I'm saying, and that's fine. I admit I'm probably not the best person to ask what would you do differently with Star Trek, but that's okay. If you're a more qualified person to ask that question to, then I implore you to make a video similar to this one and let me know about it, or tell me what you think of this video in the comments below. In the meantime, I've rambled far longer than I planned to, so I will be ending this video very shortly. Until then, I will see you tomorrow with a different kind of video. Have a good day.